He'd been cutting hair for 25 years, but no one in town knew his real story until that day. When the young Marine customer froze at what he saw during his haircut, Frank's past was finally about to surface. Welcome to Unsung Valor Stories. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure these voices are heard. Frank's barbershop sat at the end of Main Street, next to an old gas station. The Frank's Cut sign in the window had faded over the years, its edges slightly worn. Inside was just as simple. 3 old leather chairs, painted mirrors, and a few old photographs hanging on the walls. Nothing flashy, nothing attention-grabbing. Just like Frank himself. Frank Kowalski was 63 but looked like he was in his 50s. He had thick white hair, always neatly cut, a strong jawline and gray eyes. He never raised his voice when he spoke. He rarely said more than "yes, sir," or "how would you like it" to his customers. And they didn't ask him many questions either. This silent understanding had lasted for 25 years. The older folks in town remembered when Frank first arrived in 1999. He was in his late 30s then, alone, and avoided talking about his past. He just said he wanted to cut hair, wouldn't bother anyone, and opened his shop. In the quarter century since, he'd kept his word. That Monday morning was like any other. Frank opened his shop at exactly 8, brewed his coffee, and waited for his first customer. October rain was falling outside, and there wasn't much movement on the streets. Until that green Jeep Grand Cherokee parked outside. The young man who got out caught Frank's attention. About 25, athletic build, short cropped hair. There was a military bearing in his walk. Frank recognized that kind of walk. The way the shoulders sat slightly back, the measured steps, the way he scanned his surroundings. This kid was military. When the young man entered the shop, he greeted politely. "Good morning, sir. Could I get a haircut?" Frank nodded. "Sure, take the middle chair." As the customer sat down, Frank studied him in the mirror. Straight neck, calloused but well-maintained hands. He wore civilian clothes, but his posture was completely military. Frank was skilled at noticing these kinds of details. Years ago, his survival had depended on seeing such things. "How would you like it cut?" Frank asked, picking up his clippers. "Short on the sides, a little longer on top, a bit longer than military reg." Frank's hand paused for a moment. Military regulation. This kid wasn't just a former soldier. He was still active duty. And he'd noticed that Frank understood the terminology. "Got it," Frank said calmly and began his work. The first 10 minutes passed in silence. Frank skillfully wielded the clippers, gently guiding the young man's head. The customer seemed relaxed too, until Frank leaned in to trim the back of his neck. That's when everything changed. The young man saw Frank's neck in the mirror. From between his arms, beneath the collar of his t-shirt, was a faded tattoo. At first he couldn't make out what it was, but a second later his breath caught. The tattoo was a combination of an eagle and anchor. It was very faded, nearly erased by years of exposure. But the young man recognized that symbol, because only one group of people could carry that tattoo. Navy SEALs. "Sir," the young man said, his voice trembling. "That, what I saw on your neck." Frank stopped the clippers. He looked into the young man's eyes in the mirror. For a second, no one spoke. Then Frank took a deep breath. "What did you see, son?" "That SEAL trident." Are you a SEAL?" Frank slowly set the clippers on the counter. No one had asked this question in 25 years. No one had looked that closely. But now the secret was out. "Used to be," Frank said, weight in his voice. "Long time ago." The young man's eyes lit up. "I'm Marcus. Marcus Rodriguez, Marines, 2nd Recon Battalion." Frank nodded. "Frank Kowalski, former SEAL Team 6. In that moment, the atmosphere in the shop completely changed. 2 soldiers now recognized each other. Rank didn't matter. Age didn't matter. There was only brotherhood. "Sir," Marcus said respectfully, "how long have you been a barber?" "Since 1999, right after I retired." "Why did you choose to be a barber?" Frank paused for a moment. He rarely asked himself this question. "Because I wanted to heal people. I broke a lot of things in war. Here, I try to repair them." Marcus understood. This wasn't just a profession. It was a kind of therapy, a kind of atonement, a kind of search for peace. "How many years did you serve?" 22 years, 77 to 90. Marcus did the math. This man had served from the Cold War through the Iraq War, Grenada, Panama, Gulf War, Somalia. Who knows what he'd witnessed? "Where did you serve with Team 6? Frank's face hardened. Can't say. Still classified. Marcus nodded respectfully. Some operations would always remain secret. Some stories would never be told. Frank picked up the clippers again. Where have you been deployed? Afghanistan. 3 tours. Helmand, Kandahar. Tough places. Yes, sir. But nothing compared to where you went. Frank smiled. For the first time in 25 years, he was really smiling. Every mission is tough, son. What matters is coming back. The haircut was finished, but Marcus didn't want to get up. This man was a legend, living history. He'd retired from SEAL Team 6 and become a barber in a small town. And for 25 years, no one had known. Sir, can I ask you something? Shoot. Do you ever miss it? The operations, the team, the adrenaline. Frank looked in the mirror. He saw his own face, lined, tired, but peaceful. Every day, he said honestly. But now I'm fighting a different war, with myself. Marcus stood up and pulled money from his pocket. Frank raised his hand. This one's on the house. Sir, I can't accept that. You have to. That's an order. Marcus smiled and put the money back in his pocket. Then he thought, Sir, hope you don't mind me asking, why here? In this small town? Frank looked out the window. Outside, the rain was still falling. The streets were quiet, peaceful. Because here, no one expects me to be a superhero. Being a good barber is enough. That night when Marcus returned to base, he told his buddies about Frank. At first, they didn't believe him. The old barber in town was from SEAL Team 6? Impossible. But the next day, all 3 of them went. When Frank saw them, he understood. Marcus had talked, but he wasn't angry. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. The 3 young Marines took turns getting haircuts. Frank cut all their hair, never mentioning his operations. But they asked, and Frank answered as much as he could. Were you in Grenada, sir? Yes. Panama? Yes. The Gulf? Yes. With each yes, the young soldier's respect grew. This man had lived through history. He'd been in America's toughest operations. A week later, Frank's shop had transformed into something different. Young soldiers weren't just coming for haircuts. They came for advice, to hear stories, to find peace. Frank was uncomfortable at first. For 25 years, all he'd wanted was silence. But then he realized these young men needed him. What soldiers returning from war needed wasn't just therapy. It was understanding from someone who'd walked the same path before them. One day, an elderly woman came to the shop. Her eyes were tearful, and she held a photograph. Are you Mr. Kowalski? She asked. Yes, ma'am. My son Kevin was killed in Afghanistan last month. His friends said he talked about you, that he really respected you. Frank's heart clenched. This woman had lost her son. She was experiencing the greatest pain. I'm so sorry, our Frank said. What kind of boy was Kevin? The woman showed the photograph. A young, smiling soldier. He was a good boy. He fought for his country. But sometimes he was so scared. His friends said you calmed him down, gave him courage. Frank understood then. Kevin was probably one of the young men who'd come here. Maybe he'd gotten a haircut. Maybe they'd just talked. But Frank didn't remember him. Too many young soldiers came through. Ma'am, Frank said, Kevin died a hero. That should never be forgotten. The woman began to cry. Frank gave her a glass of water, seated her, and waited patiently. Then the woman stood, shook his hand, and left. That night Frank thought long and hard. Maybe it was time to stop hiding completely. Maybe the greatest gift he could give these young soldiers was sharing his experiences. The next week, the local newspaper said they wanted to interview Frank. Frank refused at first, but then he accepted. He only gave general information, didn't get into classified operations, but the town finally learned the truth. After the interview was published, a line formed outside the shop. Not just soldiers, but veterans, families, curious people. Frank felt overwhelmed at first, but then he understood that people wanted to show him respect. One morning when he came to his shop, he found a wreath at his door. It read, "Thank you for your service." There was no signature. Frank brought the wreath inside and hung it on the wall. From that day on, something special was done for every veteran who came to the shop. The walls filled with commendation certificates, old photographs, and letters. Frank's shop became an unofficial veteran meeting center. One day an old friend came, Tony DeMarco, former SEAL Team 8. He was spending his retirement in Florida, but had come specifically to see Frank. "Frank, god damn, I've been looking for you for 20 years." The two old friends embraced. Tony smiled as he looked around. "You've made this place nice, but you always loved cutting hair. You used to cut our hair in Afghanistan, too." Frank smiled. "Back then, it was a survival skill. Now it's art." Tony took on a serious expression. "Frank, I struggled a lot after I retired. PTSD, depression, alcohol. I went through it all. How do you seem so peaceful?" Frank thought. He sometimes asked himself this question too. "Because I have a purpose here. I touch these young men. I help them. I have a chance to give back what we took in war." Tony nodded. "You're right. I should start doing something too." From that day on, Tony also settled in town. He began veteran counseling. Frank's shop was now not just a barbershop, but a veteran support center. Months passed. Frank's story spread through the region. TV stations wanted to interview him, but Frank refused. Offers came for him to write a book. He refused those too. He just wanted to cut hair. But something had changed. He was no longer hiding. He'd accepted who he was. He'd made peace with his past. A year later, Marcus got promoted and transferred to another base. Before leaving, he came to Frank. "Sir, I want to thank you." "For what?" "You taught me how a hero ages. Quietly, humbly, but never losing his importance." Frank touched Marcus's shoulder. "You'll be a hero too, son. Just be patient." Marcus left, but his story remained. Every young soldier who passed through Frank's shop no longer feared old age, because they knew they could live meaningful lives even after retirement. 3 years had passed, and Frank's shop had become the heart of the town. Not just a barber shop, but a veteran counseling center, a story-sharing space, and a meeting point for silent heroes. Frank had been surprised by this transformation, but he no longer resisted it. He embraced this new role. One Christmas morning, when he opened his shop, he saw a group waiting at his door. An elderly man, his wife, and a young woman. There was something familiar about the old man's walk. Frank recognized him, a former Vietnam veteran, but he'd never come to the shop. "Mr. Kowalski," the old man said, "I'm William Peterson. I was with the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam. This is my wife, Helen, and my daughter, Sarah." Frank extended his hand. "Welcome. How can I help you?" "Actually, we want to help you," Sarah said. "My father heard your story, and he understands how valuable what you're doing is." William stepped forward. "Mr. Kowalski, when I returned from war, I struggled terribly. No one could understand. But you're doing that for these young men. You understand them. That's so valuable." Helen spoke. "William shut himself away for years. But in the last few years after hearing your story, he's changed. He started telling his own story." Frank didn't understand what this meant yet. Sarah explained, "We want to start a foundation, a veteran support foundation, and we want to make your shop the official center. Of course, if you agree." Frank was surprised. "I'm just a barber. I can't do big things." "Mr. Kowalski," William said seriously, "you're already doing big things. You just don't realize it." That day, Frank thought a lot. The foundation idea excited him, but also frightened him. It meant big responsibility. But maybe it was time. A week later, he made his decision. He accepted the foundation, but with one condition. The simplicity of his shop wouldn't be compromised. He would still be a barber, still cut hair. Foundation business would be conducted in the side room. At their first official meeting, there were 12 veterans, all from different ages, different wars: Vietnam, Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each had their story, each had their wounds. Frank listened to them. For the first time, he was sitting with so many veterans together, and he realized they all had a common point: the feeling of not being understood. "Gentlemen," Frank said, "I can't be a therapist for you, but I can listen, and I can share my experience." From that day on, they began meeting every week, in Frank's shop, around the barber chairs, drinking coffee, sharing stories. No one called it therapy, no one called it treatment. They just called it meeting. Over time, the group grew. Not just veterans, but their families began joining. Wives, children, mothers, fathers. Everyone understanding, everyone supporting. One day Frank looked at himself in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. There was peace in his face. For the first time in many years, he was truly at peace. He wasn't just doing his duty, he was healing himself too. On the evening of the Foundation's anniversary, Sarah had prepared a surprise for him. A large frame hung on the wall. Inside were hundreds of photographs, photos of every veteran, every family who'd come to the shop. "Mr. Kowalski," Sarah said, "this is your real service record. Not operations, but the lives you've touched." Frank cried then. He hadn't cried in years, but this time they were tears of happiness. Marcus had come that night on special leave. He was now a sergeant and leader of his own team. When he saw Frank, he ran and hugged him. "Sir, I'm here today because of you. You taught me not just how to fight, but how to find peace." Frank looked at him. That young soldier was now a mature commander, but he still maintained his respect. "Marcus, you were already strong. I just helped you realize it." That night during the conversations, Frank noticed the town's mayor. When he came over, he looked serious. "Mr. Kowalski, could I speak with you?" Frank was curious. "Sure. As the municipality, we want to do something for you. We're thinking of naming Main Street as Frank Kowalski Veteran Memorial Street." Frank was surprised. "That's too much. I don't deserve this." "Mr. Kowalski, there's nothing you don't deserve. You've changed this town." But Frank refused. "If you're going to give a name, give it for all veterans. Not just for me." The mayor smiled. "I knew you'd say that. Then let it be Veterans Way." A year later, the street's name was officially changed. A small ceremony was held in front of Frank's shop. The entire town participated. Frank had to give a speech. "Friends," he said into the microphone, "I came here just to cut hair. But you taught me so much more. You taught me that service can be not just in war, but in peace." The crowd applauded, but Frank continued. "This street isn't just for me. It's for every veteran who lives here, comes here, finds peace here. Because we're all fighting the same war, the war of making peace with ourselves." Many media came that day. TV stations, newspapers, magazines. They all wanted to interview Frank, but Frank only accepted one, the local newspaper. "Why only the local newspaper?" Sarah asked. "Because the real story is here, in this town. We don't need big media." But the story spread. On social media, veteran forums, military websites. Frank's story gave hope. It guided retired veterans. Letters began arriving. Veterans from all over the country were writing. Some were thank you letters, some were requests for help. Frank read them all, answered as many as he could. One letter particularly affected him. It was from an elderly woman in Alaska. Her son had gone missing in Vietnam, and she'd been mourning for 50 years. After reading Frank's story, she felt hope for the first time, thinking maybe her son was living quietly somewhere like this too. Frank wrote a special letter to that woman, long, heartfelt, patient, and the woman replied a month later, "Mr. Kowalski, your letter gave me the strength to make peace with my son. I'm no longer mourning, I'm proud." These kinds of moments showed Frank that what he was doing wasn't just cutting hair. He was healing souls. 5 years later, the shop had completely transformed. There was still a barbershop, Frank still cut hair, but now there was also a veteran counseling center, a story center, a hope center. Every morning when he opened, someone was waiting at his door. Sometimes young soldiers, sometimes old veterans, sometimes families. All looking for the same thing, understanding. Frank was now 70. His hair had turned completely white, his hands trembled slightly, but his spirit was young, because he had a purpose, a mission. One day Tony brought him an offer. "Frank, I have a friend in Florida. He's building a big veteran hospital. He wants to work with you. Big salary, big opportunities." Frank refused without thinking. "Tony, my place is here, at this chair, with these people." "But Frank, you could help thousands of veterans there." "I help them here too, maybe fewer in number, but deeper." Tony understood. Frank's choice was quality, not quantity. That year, the town organized a festival in Frank's honor, called Veteran Appreciation Day. Veterans came from all surrounding counties to meet Frank, hear his story, thank him. On festival day, Frank kept his shop open, but he didn't cut any hair that day. He just talked, listened, shared stories. He shook hands with hundreds of people, heard hundreds of stories. In the evening, he was tired but happy. Sarah asked him, "Do you regret it, drawing so much attention?" Frank looked out the window. There were still veterans on the street, talking in groups, sharing stories. "I don't regret it, because they're not alone anymore." That night, Frank wrote in his diary, "Today I realized that my real operation started 25 years ago. My most important mission is in this town, in this shop, at this chair. Because war doesn't just continue on the battlefield, but at home too. And here we're winning." Marcus was now a major and running his own command. He visited Frank twice a year. On his last visit, he'd brought a gift, a photo of the young soldiers in his unit. "Sir, I told them your story. They all admire you. If you allow, I'd like to bring them too." Frank smiled. "Bring them, son. There's room for everyone." Now 3 generations met in the shop. Frank, middle-aged veterans, and young soldiers. Everyone learning from each other. Young soldiers learned calm, patience, and wisdom from Frank. Middle-aged veterans learned reconciliation and hope from Frank, and Frank learned energy from the young, experience from the old. A year later, Frank had a heart attack. It was a mild attack, but he stayed in the hospital for 3 days. During those 3 days, someone was always waiting outside the shop. They took turns keeping watch. When Frank came out of the hospital, hundreds of people were at his door. Everyone applauded. Everyone hugged him. Frank realized then that he was no longer just a barber. He'd become the father of a family. His doctor had advised him to work less, but Frank didn't listen. "Doctor," he'd said, "my medicine is the people in that shop. I can't get better without them." On his 75th birthday, the town prepared a big surprise for him. They erected a large monument on Main Street. Frank's name wasn't on it. It just read, "To silent heroes, silent heroes." When Frank saw the monument, he cried, because this wasn't just for him. It was for all silent heroes, for everyone who was invisible, unknown, but changed the world with their presence. In his speech, he said, "Heroism isn't just on the battlefield. Heroism is trying to be a little better every day. This monument is for all of us." That night before going to bed, Frank looked in the mirror. He saw an old man with white hair and a wrinkled face. But there was light in his eyes, because he'd found the meaning of his life. "Frank," he said to himself, "you were a good warrior, but you became a better peace warrior." The next morning he opened his shop as always. The first customer was a young Marine, about Marcus's age. As he sat in the chair, he asked, "Sir, could I get a military cut?" Frank smiled and picked up his clippers. "Sure, son. Tell me, where are you stationed?" And it began again. A new story, a new connection, a new hope. Because Frank Kowalski now knew that his real duty would never end. He would serve forever. Only the form had changed. Frank Kowalski was no longer just a barber. He was a bridge between past and future, between war and peace, between fear and hope. And every day when he picked up his clippers, he wasn't just cutting hair. He was touching lives. He was healing souls. He was continuing to serve. Because real heroes never retire. They just change the way they serve. And Frank's story was the most beautiful example of silent heroism. Quiet, humble, but infinitely effective. Now I ask you, have you ever met someone like this? Someone who seemed ordinary, but had an extraordinary past? Share their names in the comments. Tell their stories. Because at the Human Stories, we believe in not letting people who live greatness quietly be forgotten. If this story touched you, subscribe, share, and help these voices be heard. Until the next story. Until then, look a little more carefully at the elderly people you encounter. Maybe they're from the hidden pages of history,